and welcome back to Chess Opening Explained. My name is Caleb Denby, and today I am going to be taking you through one of the most famous chess matches to be played throughout history. Of course, tonight I am talking about the Kasparov Karpov match from 1985, where Kasparov dethroned Anatoly Karpov to take his World Championship title. Now, the reason I wanted to focus on a match like this is because these World Championship matches, really at any point throughout the past like 30, 40 years, this is where players like Kasparov, like Karpov, and nowadays like Magnus Carlsen, like Fabiano Caruana, and like, I don't know, perhaps Jan Nepomniachtchi, Maxime Vachier-Lagrave this year, still remains to be seen. But this is where these best of the best players take months off from their standard careers. You know, they take breaks from these other huge tournaments, and what they do is they go somewhere warm and sunny, and they take, 5 to 10 of their closest friends with them, and their closest friends spend all of their days in this nice and sunny weather, locked in a basement looking at computer screens, trying their hardest to prepare openings. So there is one opening line in particular that went really well for Karpov in this match, and I wanted to kind of go game by game each time this opening line was played and see how each players were reacting to each other, what interesting novelties they kind of came up with against each other, and how they ended up favoring Kasparov in the end. So why don't we just jump right into it. The line I want to talk about actually first appeared in game 1 of the match. Garry Kasparov, with the white pieces in game 1, came out with d4. Anatoly responded knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3, bishop b4, and of course this is the Nimzo-Indian defense. Now there are a lot of different moves that white can play here. f3 is a personal favorite of mine, as many of you may know, but Gary's fourth move in this game was actually the first time it appeared on the board between Kasparov and Karpov. Of course, they had played this position many, many times, but this was the first time, I believe, that Garry played the move knight f3. So this was a bit of a shocker to Anatoly Karpov, and this is what you can expect to see at a lot of these World Championship matches. These players want to play something that their opponents aren't ready for, and so they'll often take this opportunity at the highest level, at the most important match of their lives, to try something they have not seen on the board yet. So knight f3. And now, knight f3 is interesting. It's not really seen as the most critical line against the Nimzo-Indian these days. And the reason for that is it's just not very testing, right? Black is threatening to take on c3 and fracture the white pawn structure, also going for some squares in the middle, like e4. Knight f3 removes the option of ever moving this pawn to f3, or even to f4. It also removes the option of bringing this knight to e2 to help support this knight on c3. So knight f3, while it's a perfectly fine move, and in fact it is a move that aims for some really important central squares like e5, it's not really seen as the most threatening. That being said, though, the question is now on Anatoly Karpov, and you can spend hours and hours and hours getting ready for a match, but you can't prepare every line in the game of chess. There's just simply too many. And this is one of those ones where perhaps Karpov thought that he could rely more on his common sense and intuition and chess ability rather than opening prep, and we'll see, didn't quite work out for him here. So Karpov chose c5, and this is one of the most common lines. In fact, I think it is the most common line against knight f3. The point is, you immediately strike back in the center. Now, Kasparov chooses the move g3, just preparing to fianchetto this bishop and get on this nice long open diagonal, which has actually been weakened by the move c5. Now that this pawn is on c5, it can no longer step to c6, and this just feels a little bit more loose. Now, by far, the most popular move here is c takes d4. C takes d4 is really what the players play these days. And there are games here, between Magnus Carlsen and Fabi Caruana. Wesley So has played this with black. Vlad Kramnik has played this with black. Vishy Anand has played this with black. But Karpov chose the much less common knight e4. And already he is walking a dangerous tightrope here. Knight e4 is a move that you play when you are absolutely prepared for a line. And I think Karpov really didn't do the homework on this one, which is why it's so interesting to see how Garry won this game. So after knight e4, there are a few moves that have been played. Queen c2 is one, even bishop d2 is one, just breaking the pin like this. Garry plays this move though, queen to d3. And now we get a really interesting position here, where this knight is not going to remain on the e4 square. You don't really want to play something like f5, it just feels a little bit too weakening. d5, in fact, is also a little bit premature here. You're just not quite ready to play these breaks in the center. If d5, probably even just the simple bishop g2, and without this knight on f6, d5 is seriously going to be a weak point. So in the game, queen a5 was Karpov's choice. And this is still an okay move. Plenty of top players have actually played this position. But now, after queen takes e4, we see the move bishop takes c3 with check. And the point for white is not to recapture this bishop, when after queen takes, you're going to lose a rook on a1, but rather just to play the move bishop d2. So white captures a knight on e4, black captures a knight on d2. The play continues pretty naturally here. Bishop takes d2 is more or less forced. Now knight takes d2. And this is where perhaps Anatoly started to go a bit awry. Now, obviously, I didn't see this match happen live, but from what I've read about the match, Karpov spent an enormous amount of time on these first few moves. And this move in particular is probably the first time when he thought he could play something that looks fairly natural, but in reality, it is a little bit less comfortable than you would want. So by far the main move here is knight c6, and this is a position that was actually played as recently as 2015 by Timur Radjabov. Of course, Radjabov, also one of the world's best. And that game continued d takes c5, queen c5, bishop d2, b5, and after a few more moves, the queens got traded. B takes c4, takes, with so many pieces liquidated. White can target this weakness on c6 perhaps. White's going to have a pretty nice knight here with squares like e5 and d6 and a5 to even look at, but this turned out to be nothing, and a simple draw between Fabi Caruana and Radjabov there. But instead of knight c6, Karpov plays this slightly weird looking move, queen b6. And this is one of those moves where, like, perhaps you've seen it once, you know it should be fine for black, but if you really haven't done the homework here, then you could get a little bit stuck. And in fact, that's what happens here. D takes c5 is the natural response from Kasparov. Of course, this pawn was under a lot of pressure. Now, rather than take back on c5, this would be a pretty bad position where white is just up in development and up a little bit in this central space. Karpov goes for queen takes b2. Rook b1 is the only move, and now this is really the move where Kasparov could solidify his advantage. Karpov needed to play the move queen a3 to keep things a bit more level. Queen a3 is, frankly, just a better square looking at this pawn on c5. Now, the move queen a2 isn't really what black is interested in doing. This queen is going to be pretty far out of play. And now the move queen d4 is going to come on the board, and the king side is going to come under some fire. But rather, queen a3 is the way to get the queen back into play, with the key point being you are attacking this pawn on c5. Now, queen d4 is the most common move here, but black simply castles. And like I said, this pressure here is going to be enough to get the queen in. If white gets a little bit funny and tries something like rook b3, we can always step back to a5 and come back this way. Moves like knight a6 are going to come next to really ensure that we are getting this pawn back. But rather than queen a3, Karpov chose the move queen c3 here. And now Garry Kasparov, I believe, simply has a very nice advantage. The move queen d3 is how he solidifies that advantage. Note these pawns were doubled and isolated, but after queen d3, black really doesn't want to play a move like queen a5 or queen e5. for various reasons, one of which being, for example, queen e5. The move queen d6 really makes things awkward for black, and you're going to have to trade these queens anyways. So queen takes d3 is the best move. E takes d3 now. And the problem for black is that it's not so simple anymore to regain this pawn on c5. Now this isn't an extra pawn for white. Material is in fact even in this position. But if you just look at the activity of the white pieces, you can really see that if black's not up a pawn here, black's going to be in quite a bit of danger. Personally, I think if in this position you take this pawn off the board, maybe black can claim some kind of equality, but I honestly doubt it. I think I would still prefer white without the c5 pawn on the board. That's just how active the pieces are. And Garry won this opening battle rather convincingly. I will play through the rest of this game to let you see how Garry ended up converting. The move d4, of course, is the point for white here, solidifying this pawn here on c5. And perhaps you guys at home can kind of guess what the best move in my opinion is. It's not a pretty move. It's not a move you enjoy making, but I think it's a move that has to be made here. So I'll let the chat go ahead and try and figure out what move ended up being played in this position and what move I think should have been played. Yes. Also, yeah, hello to everyone in the chat. I know that was a long bit of just me talking, but I hope you guys enjoyed some of the background on this match. Hello to Arch. Hello Abhishek, who is claiming I'm a genius. Hard to disagree. Just kidding. Just kidding. I do a lot of prep. Subakura says the move h5. That's a little bit beside the point. Rook b8 is the move that was played in the game. Rook b8 isn't a bad move at all. But yeah, the chat is saying it now. The move I would have liked to see is actually this move e5. I think this is something that Karpov definitely should have considered. Rook b8 and b6 are still going to have to come at some point in the game, so it makes a little bit of sense to start with those as well. But I like playing e5 as soon as I can. The reason being, this knight really does need to get back into the game, and if we're not taking on c5, this knight's just going to be awful. And with e5, I don't think white would even capture on e5. White is likely still a fair bit better here, but I think this is being a little bit too kind to Karpov. In fact, probably just the move bishop g2 would come, and then maybe eventually we do have to take this actually, but you could probably even consider just leaving it there and going for some really serious counterplay immediately. But yeah, I like the move e5. The point being, we need to get this knight back into the game. e5 looks entirely unnatural, but it's kind of what you have to do at this point. Rook b8 played in the game, though. Like I said, also a move that was going to be required from Karpov at some point. Bishop g2 now. Like I said, just pressuring on this long diagonal. Note, no c-pawn. Not playing c6 here, never playing c6 here. Part of the downside of playing c5. And once again, I think the move e5 is called for. Black chose king e7 instead, going for a different way to get the knight back into the game. Now king e2 and rook d8 from Karpov. Knight e4 though, and this is really showing that things have gone quite poorly. The move b6 is Karpov's try. You really do have to develop these pieces somehow, but now after knight d6, this bishop can't even come to b7, and this is just the saddest chess position I've ever seen in my life. Knight c7, played in the game, but honestly, it's difficult to argue that the knight on c7 is an improvement from the knight on a6. The idea is to come to e8 and kick this knight out of d6, but it's all just a fair bit too slow. Rook b4 is natural from Kasparov, getting ready to double and just win on the queen's side. Knight e8 does come on the board, knight takes e8, king takes e8, and rook b1 to follow. This bishop finally comes to an active square, but it's a little bit too little, too late. King e3 unpins. The move d5 is what Karpov tried, but this is really a losing move. I think Karpov is already losing in this position. Maybe you can try a bit harder with just sitting. Honestly, it's really difficult to come up with a move for black here. You're just losing the b6 pawn, and with the b6 pawn, you're losing the game. Like maybe you play king e7 or something, but you can even just capture here. And at the end of the day, A pawns run. I think I didn't even play this the most accurately for white, but this would already be a really great position. I think here even the move c5 is a little bit more convincing. And you just keep the position with threats of rook a4 to come. Okay. What's happening? Oh no! Things are breaking. I better refresh. Okay. I've refreshed. Things seem to be going a bit better. My board turned black. That was terrifying. All right. Now all my sidelines are messed up, though. Oh, boy. Oh, boy. All right. Here. I found it. Okay. Skip to the end. Fun stuff. Okay. So, like I said, d5 is what Karpov tried. But now after c takes d6, this is just tactically totally busted. If you end up taking this guy back, the move c5 is just destroying the black position. So rook c8 instead hits c4 and now takes, but this is just totally dead lost. White is up a clean pawn on this queen side, and the rooks are too active, the pawns too mobile, and this game ended up going in Kasparov's favor. I played through the end pretty quickly there, but this is an openings class, so let's try to stay with the openings. Okay, moving on to game number 2 in the lecture. Game number 7 in the World Championship match. This is actually the first time that this opening line was repeated. I believe in the interim, Karpov played a couple Queen's Gambit declined games, and Kasparov tried his hand at 1e4 and was thoroughly trounced. So back to d4 it is for Kasparov. And now we end up in this Nimzo line again. Knight f3, and if you recall from game 1 didn't go very well for Karpov. So you can expect Karpov to come back to this game feeling a little bit more prepared with some more interesting ideas to counter this opening. And Karpov's choice was another slightly more uncommon move. In the first game, of course, he played c5, which leads to some very interesting positions, but here Karpov simply castles. Kasparov chooses to play bishop g5, highlighting the fact that with this bishop on b4, it's slightly more difficult to break this pin on this knight. And now the move d6 from Karpov is also pretty non-standard. And honestly, I don't love this opening choice from Karpov at all. This is kind of, okay, so with d6, what Karpov is saying is he's not going to play these moves like c5. He's not going to directly challenge the white center. And when you do that, even if your position is objectively fine, you end up in these kinds of positions where you simply have less space and you're working very, very hard to defend it. So I really didn't like this opening choice from Karpov, even though this game did end up not going totally in Garry's favor. The move e3 now from white, knight bd7 from black, queen c2 from white, b6 is the natural continuation from black, and as I said, you see that black is really playing a bit more cagey, leaving all his pieces on these first 3 ranks, of course, aside from this bishop, and not playing any pawn moves on the 5th rank here. And like I said, while doing this, you're posing no threat to the white center. And by posing no threat to the white center, white more or less has a free hand to develop any way that he sees fit. The move bishop d3 comes on the board, and Karpov plays bishop takes c3 unprovoked, which is not the most standard, but not the worst idea here either. Karpov, rather than queen takes c3, actually chooses the move b takes c3, and this is an interesting recapture by Kasparov. Here the point is he wants to open the b file and get a little bit of pressure on this side of the board. The b file is actually going to be particularly relevant in this game because that is where the bishop wants to make its home. So with a bishop on b7, black is either going to have to commit a piece to defending this bishop, or he's going to have to worry about threats of c5 when the pin on the b file is going to make his position a little bit awkward. So b takes c3. It also has the added benefit of adding a bit of support to this d4 pawn, giving this e4 pawn a bit more mobility with this pawn being backed up. Now h6 comes on the board, bishop h4, bishop b7, and then a very interesting move from Garry Kasparov. He basically baits Karpov into going for some slightly more crazy positions. It would be perfectly fine here for white to simply castle. It'd be fine here for white to play a move like e4 even, but Kasparov chooses the move knight d2. Now, I don't know how good you guys are at chess, but my level of chess is that, wait a second, I know how to count. 0 defenders on this pawn, 1 attacker. That's a free pawn. Gotta take those guys. Turns out, in this case, that way of thinking about chess might actually be correct here. As Jan Gustafsson says, a pawn is a pawn. So I think bishop takes g2 is actually just going to be really nice for black here. White does get this open g-file and a lot of pressure against the king side after a move like f4, but it's already the type of position where it's like black has less space. I don't know why Karpov went for this position. It's really uncomfortable. In positions like this where you have less space and you feel like you're just kind of sitting back and waiting for your opponent to find a way to break through, it's really nice to have something in return for that. You know, something you can hold on to and say, well, you know, my opponent might have all the plans, but look at me, I've got a g-pawn. He doesn't have a g-pawn, and I have a g-pawn. And this is something that a lot of the top players today now actually do. When they find themselves, you know, in a slightly positionally worse circumstance, they like to have something to play for. So that's when you'll see them take slightly bigger risks, going for more materialistic ideas, saying, you know, if I can't have a good position, at least I'll have a material edge, and then I have something to play for. So I really would have liked bishop takes g2 here by Karpov. Instead, though, the move g5 breaks the pin on this knight, and after bishop g3, if you're going to take on g2, you should have done it before playing g5. So that idea has kind of sailed. The move knight h5 was Anatoly's idea here. Now Kasparov plays a slightly strange move, queen d1, challenging this knight, forcing it to make a decision immediately. Either black is ready to take on g3 and open up the h-file, or he's not. In this case, he was not, and played knight g7. Unfortunately for Anatoly, I think this was one step too far. The move knight g7 is really just kind of asking for it here. I mean, you play h6, you play g5, you play knight h5. If you play all of these moves only to play the move knight g7, something is a bit fishy here. Knight h5 was clearly with the intent of taking this bishop on g3, and I think he just kind of wussed out, for lack of a better term. You know, it's easy to be afraid of this h-file. You know, moves like queen h5 look very threatening, but after rook h8, this pawn is defended, and it's not so easy at all for white to break through. Of course, that's easy for me to sit here and say in the year 2020, having analyzed this game, having had this game analyzed, you know, countless times before me, and you know, I'm not sitting across the table from Garry Kasparov, but the move knight g7 really just feels like it's asking for it here. And so I'll ask you guys at home to find the move for white that continues the attack, well, rather kind of begins the attack, taking advantage of black's slightly soft last move. Yes, gift me the pawn. That one is not a Jan Gustafsson quote, but rather a Yasser Seirawan quote. Gift me the pawn. All right, I'm not going to wait the full duration for the chat delay to catch up. I assume most of you guys have it here. The move is h4. Black has weakened his structure rather needlessly, and then rather than following through on his idea, he is allowing white to simply open up this h-file more favorably. I think g7 may be my least favorite square for a knight, honestly, because somehow it's right in front of the king, but defends none of the relevant squares. It doesn't defend any of these squares. It's just not a good square for a knight. f5 is Anatoly's reply to h4. No need to stop now for Kasparov. He continues through, takes, and now he has an open h-file to play with against this black king. White's next move is also fairly natural. Note that I said one of the big benefits of taking back on c3 with the pawn is, yes, it opens up this b file for some potential play, but it also supports this d4 pawn, which makes this e pawn gain a mobility. And that's why we see Kasparov play the move f3 here. He's looking at potential e4 ideas later on, but for the moment, he's giving his bishop a nice score on f2 to drop back. He's also taking away any approaching squares that this knight would be aiming for. So f3, queen e7 by Karpov, and now queen b3 by Kasparov. Like I said, pressure on the b file. And now black is forced to play a move, king f7. He simply doesn't have enough space for his pieces, and he needs to get this king out of the way so that he can challenge these rooks on the h file here. Kasparov naturally castles queenside. Note that because black really hasn't challenged the center at all, he's more than happy to castle on this side of the board because black is so far away from opening any of these files from getting at this king. Rook h8 now is begging for some trades, and now this is where Kasparov kind of starts to let it slip just a little bit, I think. In this position, after some analysis, I do believe the best plan is to play for an e4 move. I think if white can achieve the move e4, start threatening things like e takes f5, or if black responds with an f4, moves like g3, this is how white can really open things up in front of this black king. In the game, however, Kasparov went for an immediate c5. Just to show you an example line, though, for example, bishop f2, stepping out of the way of f4. If black plays some move, like a5, for example, you can continue now immediately with a move like e4, or you can continue prepping it with something like queen c2, and eventually, black is going to try to find counterplay, but the move e4 is going to come. And there's just simply no good reply to this. If you play the move f4, like I said, the move g3 is going to be powerful. The move e5, in this case, is also just kind of dominating, opening up this diagonal entirely. If you take here, well, we'll simply take back with some piece. I think any piece is fine. With the pawn, seems fairly natural. With the open f-file, weak g-pawn, threats of e5. This is really just going to be devastating for black, in my opinion. Now, I didn't play the best moves for black here. I just kind of made some random pawn moves and let white do what he was hoping to do. But the fact is, it's really difficult to play against this idea for black here. You can't really stop e4. White just has too much firepower on this square. So I think that might have been a better way to continue for Kasparov. Instead, though, the move c5. Now, after d takes c5, knight c4, white is still doing pretty well here, but he's kind of sacrificed this pawn for no good reason. Now, lacking this pawn on c3, the move e4 is going to be a lot more difficult to actually pull off here. And in fact, after the move f4 and bishop f2, the move knight h5 comes on the board, and the move e4 is starting to feel more and more just kind of empty. This knight could potentially return, and now with this pawn also missing from the c4 square, the d5 square is going to become available to black if you ever dare push this pawn to e5. So these c-pawns, they were important, Gary. Why did you give them away? They did really good stuff here. And I think that's where most of white's advantage started to slip. After knight h5, bishop c2 was Gary's choice. Another slightly weird move. F takes e3, bishop takes e3, and now the move bishop d5. And black is more or less doing totally fine now. He's gotten his pieces into the game. The white center has somehow self-destructed, and black is doing fine. And this game did, in fact, end up in a draw rather shortly. Bishop takes f4, and now after rook takes h8, queen to g6 check, king f8. White has backed himself into a little bit of a corner, and Gary had to go for a perpetual check here. Rook takes d5 is the sacrifice to find it. E takes d5, and they agreed to a draw here. The idea is simply queen f5 check, when queen c8 check is enough for the draw. No way to escape these checks for black. So they agreed to a draw after e takes d5. But this being an openings class, I wanted to stress how poorly this opening went for Anatoly. They really don't play chess like this anymore at the top level. You have to do something. You have to challenge your opponent in some way. Because if you just give them a free hand, as Anatoly did in this game, more than likely, they're going to be able to use it to get an advantage, as Garry did, opening up this H-file, getting at that black king. So, lesson from this game, do something in the opening, okay? Don't just sit back and do nothing always. Moving on to game 3 of the lecture, this is game 11 in the match, and this is actually one of the more famous ones. In this one, Anatoly did finally seem to figure out the opening. Well, wait a second. No. This isn't game 11 yet. This is round 13. Where's game 11? Hold on. Here's game 11. I found it. Sorry. Got a little bit out of order there. So let's take a look. d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3, bishop b4, knight f3 once again from Garry. It's working for him. Why not stick to it? And now Anatoly goes for this castling move again, rather than the immediate c5. But after bishop g5, he perhaps realized his foolishness with playing d6 and, doing nothing all game long and then suffering. So he chose c5 in this case. And once again, this is back into pretty normal territory. This is perfectly fine for black. The move e3 is Garry's reply here. Note that this is a little bit different than the g3 we had seen previously, but the difference here is we've already gotten this bishop outside the pawn chain, so we're more than happy to play the move e3. C takes d4, e takes d4, and now the move h6 feels a little bit early, but it is perfectly fine. Bishop h4 comes on the board, and now Anatoly goes for the move d5 with some slightly more normal looking queen's pawn positions. You could get this way, you could get this position from a variety of different opening lines. It's one of those positions in queen's gambit structures that just seems to always kind of appear in some fashion. Of course, this is going to end up being an isolated queen's pawn, one of the most common structures in all of chess. Rook c1 was Garry's choice. Now the move d takes c4 perhaps comes a little bit early, allowing Garry to develop this bishop with tempo, but Karpov is simply securing the IQP structure, a structure he probably knows a little bit better than the craziness we saw in these first two games. So Anatoly falling back on the idea that if he just can get a chess game, he'll be able to do all right. Knight c6 to follow is perfectly natural. Now castles. Bishop e7 is a really nice move from Karpov, just because he played bishop b4. Once this bishop has kind of outlived its usefulness here, you don't really need to kill it for no reason. The bishop is doing well on e7 here, so good move by Karpov. Now the move rook e1 comes on the board. Pretty natural stuff from white, putting the rooks on the open files. b6 now is attempting to develop black's last piece. The move a3 is a pretty common move in these IQP structures. It's simply really important not to let this knight get to the d5 square via b4. Sometimes it gets there via e7, but it is slightly more awkward for black than the more natural knight b4 to d5. Bishop b7 is the natural follow-up. Now bishop g3, and it is kind of just a chess game at this point. Rook c8 challenges these rooks. Bishop a2, bishop d6 offers a trade. And now, with d5, white is more or less saying, okay, good game of chess. I'll play d5. We'll simplify some stuff. Perhaps I will have slightly more activity for the immediate future. I'm going to try to make something of it there. But if I can't, good game, we'll agree to a draw. Knight takes d5, knight takes d5, bishop takes g3, h takes g3, and now e takes d5, bishop takes d5. And this is one of those positions where if white can prove something in the next, I don't know, say 3, 4, 5 moves, then white might have a bit of an advantage. But in this case, there's simply not enough left on the board to be able to prove anything, and black is doing totally fine here. The move queen f6 comes on the board, hitting the b2 pawn. Queen a4 is Garry's reply, countering with an attack on the a7 pawn. And now, after the move rook fd8, hitting this bishop, rook cd1 was played. And now the move rook d7. And black is, I'm not going to lie to you here, just totally dead equal at this point. Black got the rooks into play. There's a little bit of pressure on c6, but it's so well defended that nothing is really going to happen there. The a7 pawn is, something white's trying to attack, but you can't ever really get to it because now this pawn is even defended. In addition to that, b2 is always hanging in reply. and this is just a dead equal position. So what does Garry do in the dead equal position? Well, of course, he tries to swindle his opponent. He plays the move queen g4, attacking a rook. Now this move does attack a rook, and Karpov quickly replied with the move rook c to d8. Now, those of you at home, this is one of the most famous chess puzzles of all time, I think. But white to move and win. Garry successfully has swindled Anatoly Karpov in this equal position, and now will win the game with style. So I encourage you guys at home to go ahead, pause your video, and make an effort to try and find the solution. King Lear remembers this Karpov missed a tactic. That is true. That is true. Okay. So chat is still waiting on some delay. I'm going to show the answer now. The move, of course, is queen takes d7, and this move simply is crushing. Of course, you have to recapture this. Your opponent just took a rook, but now the move rook e8 check comes on the board. This king is attacked, king h7, and now bishop e4 check. And these white rooks are just far, 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 far too powerful. Here, I believe Karpov resigned, to the best of my memory. The game could have continued with something like g6, rook takes d7, the bishop's attacked, bishop a6, bishop takes, and then if you take this guy back, well, this is checkmate. So a very, very quick win by Garry Kasparov in this World Championship match. This is one of the more famous games, but for the purposes of this lecture, we love those tactics and all. This is a great way for black to equalize that Anatoly Karpov has found. So while Garry did walk away with the full point from that position, perhaps Anatoly Karpov won the opening battle, meaning the next time we see this opening, perhaps Garry is going to have to try something a little bit different. Like I said, these IQP positions, if white has to end up playing d5 and simplify, more often than not, it's just going to be equal. Why don't we jump to game number 4 for the lecture? There are 6 games in the World Championship match that followed this line. I want to hope to get to them all. And this game actually occurred the next time Garry had white, round 13 of the match. It went d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3, bishop e4, knight f3, and now the move c5. Karpov kind of comes full circle, perhaps realizing that the most popular move order is actually the best move order. So this is what happened in game 1. And note that in the previous game, black castled first, and then after bishop g5, played c5. But this allows white this option of playing e3 with this bishop outside the pawn chain. Here, e3 is slightly less easy. You know, you don't really want to box in your bishop like this unless you have to. So because of that, Kasparov repeated his move from game 1, g3, and now Karpov did not go down that same variation that led him to tragedy in game 1 with knight e4, rather first including the move knight c6, and this is actually a pretty clever addition. Now after the move bishop g4, or bishop g2 rather, we do see the move knight e4. And what has changed here, well, Karpov has done his homework is what has changed here. And this annoying queen d3 move that brought him some strife in game 1 is not really going to be playable here for white. It's not losing by any means, but now black does have the extra option of capturing here on d4. Now after knight takes d4, you can expect knight takes c3, b takes c3, and the move knight e5. And now black is really going to be saving all of his pieces here. The queen has to keep an eye on the c3 pawn, so queen c2, bishop e7, and this is just a slightly uncomfortable structure for white here. And he has not really gotten much in return for it. So queen d3, not going to be the best move here, thanks to this nice knight on the c6 square, being able to do things like jump to e5. So, not queen d3, but rather bishop d2 was played in the game by Kasparov. Now, by far the most common move here is going to be knight takes d2, simply taking off this bishop and keeping black's options open. Karpov went for a slightly more concrete bishop takes c3. Now, of course, we've seen in previous games, rather than play a move queen takes c3, Kasparov played b takes c3, and that is actually the case here as well. Rather than bishop takes, Kasparov does go for pawn takes, solidifying the center a little bit more. Now castles by black, castles by white, and black continues with the move f5. And this one feels a little bit shaky to me. I'm not sure Karpov actually had the best prep here. Thus far, f5 more or less is the novelty in this variation, at least at the time. At the time, f5 I think was the new move that Karpov came up with here. And it's a pretty intuitive move, right? You want to defend this knight on the e4 square. You want to go after these light squares. Perhaps you can even follow up by putting a bishop on this diagonal as well. But the fact is, whenever you play the move f5, you are weakening a ton of squares. And I think that's actually the case here. Bishop e3 is Kasparov's choice. And this is actually a pawn sacrifice. So knight takes c3 does come on the board. Now queen d3, c takes d4 is an important inclusion. Knight takes d4, hits this knight again. So knight comes back to e4. And now the move c5 is Kasparov's idea. And this is a pretty interesting one. I'm not gonna lie to you guys. I kind of like what Karpov did in this game. And what's more impressive, unless he really had, you know, all of the prep for everything, I think he found this one over the board. So how do you come up with an idea like bishop e3 here? Well, the point is your opponent has just played the move f5. f5 is really weakening some of these central light squares. So what does Kasparov do? He looks for ways to open up the position while he has these two bishops, while he has an advantage in time a little bit. Note that this bishop on c8 is still completely undeveloped. So the move bishop e3 is intended to make the threat of d takes c5 even, and allow this queen to come out to d3. And already playing slightly more normal moves can be a little bit scary here. For example, if you play the move b6, first of all, the move d5 might come on the board, challenging more of these light squares. The move queen d3 might also come on the board. The move d takes c5 with the point of white's previous move might come on the board. And already, you know, white is immediately opening things up, trying to immediately take advantage of the play. So that's what you need to look for. And that's, I think, how Karpov came to the realization that bishop e3 was a pretty good move here. So knight takes c3, queen d3, c takes d4, knight takes knight e4, c5, as we said. Now, if you do take this pawn on c5, you are losing a piece to knight takes c6, counterattacking this queen, so this pawn is untouchable. The move knight takes d4 instead, bishop takes d4, b6, and now after bishop takes c4, f takes c4, and queen takes e4, this is another position where I think Karpov is just going to be slightly worse in this endgame here. Now, Karpov being Karpov did manage to draw this game, but if he wasn't Karpov, I think he might lose this one, just because the white pieces are so active already, and the black pieces struggle a bit. Bishop a6, though, is a nice move to attack this e2 pawn. C takes b6 is natural, a takes b6, and now the move queen e5 feels a little bit soft from Kasparov. It's kind of just a one-move threat here. Queen e7 and queen f6 are both moves that black was happy to play anyways. Perhaps a little bit better was the immediate rook f to b1, just challenging these weaknesses on the queen side immediately. It's going to be a little bit awkward for black in this endgame. I can't say for certain if it's enough for some very serious winning attempts, but it is something to play for. Queen e5 instead, though, and after queen f6, the queen just retreats back to h3 or to e3, and Karpov goes for some simplifications with queen h6 takes, further fracturing this pawn structure, but in return, getting the queens off the board. And now these rooks are going to come to very active squares. Bishop c4, a3, b5 cements this bishop, rook to d1, and now rook f5, bishop b2, and rook d5. This rook does get active, as previously stated, and here the players just agreed to a draw. Not too much actually to play for in this endgame. But once again, Karpov almost finding himself in a little bit of trouble here. Having to deal with the problems presented by white's bishop pair so early on is a little bit intimidating. So now let's see with the final 15 minutes how Kasparov changed it up, how Karpov changed it up in the latter part of the match. Those first few games all happened pretty early on. Of course, it was a 24-game match, so plenty of time to play these things. Now, this one is round 17, and I think by round 17, Karpov was down a game. I might be mixing a few things up there. I think he was down either 1 or 2 games at this point in the match. And so Karpov is perhaps feeling a little bit under pressure here. So let's see how he approached this one. d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3, bishop b4, knight f3, c5 once again, g3, knight c6. So Karpov going for the exact same line that we saw in the previous game. Now bishop g2, knight e4, bishop d2, takes on c3, takes on c3, castles, castles, and now the move you just saw was the move f5. And like I said, f5 actually wasn't my favorite move from Karpov, and it looked like Kasparov ended up getting a little bit of an initiative there for a few turns, although it did die quickly after the move queen e5 allowed him to simplify in that previous game. So the pressure was really on Karpov here to come up with a new move besides this f5, and that he did with the move knight a5, immediately challenging the queenside structure here by white. Of course, it does leave this knight feeling slightly more loose on the e4 square, but there's no real way for white to take advantage of this. If you play the move knight e5, well, I'm just going to take this bishop, and what have you really achieved? This is going to come through. So, knight a5, immediately creating pressure. Now, d takes d5 is Garry Kasparov's reply. And this is a bit of a strange one by Garry. These triple pawns are pretty bad, and the reason they're so bad is once you lose one, which, I mean, you're always losing one here, the other two are even more weak. Note in all those other positions where Garry ended up with an advantage, he managed to end up with a pawn on the d file. In game 1, it was by, this weird queen d3 trade. In a later game, it was... Well, in a later game, I don't think we ever saw a structure like this, but without the pawn on the d file or the b file, these pawns are really just going to be pretty weak here. So queen c7, knight d4 by Kasparov. And knight d4, I think, is the move that really gets Karpov a little bit of an edge in this game. The move bishop f4 is actually what has been played these days. There's a game from 2006 between a couple 2600s that went with bishop f4. The game continued with queen c5, knight e5, knight takes c4, and knight takes, or sorry, not knight takes d7, which I think is a bad move, but rather queen d4. It's the game of the 2600s. And after queen takes d4, c takes d4. White has fixed these pawns a little bit. Knight takes e5, d takes e5, and dealing with some awkwardness with this white, with this knight, the move f5 was in fact played in this game. Of course, it's less suspect here because the queens are already off the board. And this game continued with takes f6 and takes f6. And here, white has maybe a slight pull in these types of endgames. Bishop d6 was played, rook f7. The move knight e8 is going to come, and a move like d5. It wasn't enough for white to win in this case. So the move bishop f4, though, is really going to be the best way for white to play here. After knight d4, really the only thing white had going for him in this position was the fact that he had the bishop pair, which is why bishop f4 is the best move. Now, knight takes d2, and Karpov has absolutely nothing to worry about. Queen takes d2, knight c4, queen up to g5, protects this pawn for a moment, but f6, queen f4, knight e5, knight back to b3, rook over to b8, stepping off of the long diagonal. And, Kasparov isn't much worse, if he is worse at all, but there's certainly nothing to play for here. He's just going to be babysitting these pawns. Queen d4, b6, and Karpov is slightly more comfortably solving the problem with the bishop this game. f4 from Karpov does shake loose this knight, but the f7 square isn't so bad. Rook over to d1, now rook d8, c4, and black finishes development finally with bishop b7. We see takes, 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 c5, rook c6, still pressuring this pawn a bit, rook ac1, and now the freeing move d5 by Karpov really throws away any ideas of winning the game that white may have still had with pressure on the d file. C takes d6, rook takes d6, queen e3, takes, takes, g6, takes, 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 oh, sorry, not takes, but rather queen c5. And here the players agreed to a draw. So this, I think, is the first time when Karpov really got the better of Kasparov in this opening. But, you know, perhaps instead of the move knight d4, if the move bishop f4 had been played, Kasparov would have had a little bit of a better chance. So this is the type of one-off that you'll see in these World Championship matches. The players will play something, and if, you know, Garry had found, you know, perhaps the absolute best continuation, he has like a slight pull and an endgame, but this being totally new to him, probably he's not going to find it all. And so Karpov gets an easy draw in round 17. Now, finally, with the last 10 minutes, one more game I wanted to look at for you guys. We are going at breakneck speed here. This, of course, is game 19 in the match. Now, game 19 of 24. And this is the game that really pushed Kasparov over the edge, I think. With this win here, Kasparov, I think this is the moment when he went up 2 games. Forgive me, I don't remember the score round by round, but this was a critical win late in the match for Kasparov. And let's see how he did it, bringing out this knight f3 Nimzo weapon one more time. So the move d4, knight f6, once again, for the 6th time, we reach the Nimzo-Indian. Now knight f3, and back to his old ways, the move knight e4. Perhaps not totally back to his old ways, actually. But this same knight maneuver, the difference here, of course, is the move c5 has not been included. So once again, it is Karpov coming up with new ideas here. Now the move queen c2 is the move that was played in the game, and I think it is just going to be the best move here. Thanks to the non-inclusion of c5, white has to be slightly less worried about the pressure on d4, which is why he's more comfortable moving the queen away from the defense of this pawn. Hitting this knight now, black has to make a decision, and so black plays the move f5 even earlier in this case. Now the move g3 comes on the board. This is just going to be the best square for the bishop. And now knight c6 by Karpov is a bit of a weird one. In my database, the only time this has ever been played is this time. This has not been repeated by anybody to my knowledge. Anybody who's anybody, at least. I'm sure if you have the mega database, maybe you'll find a game or two. But this one is rather uncomfortable, actually, for black. You put this knight on c6, and I just don't fully understand why we need to do this. The knight later comes out to a5, and this was likely Karpov's point, but why are we doing this to ourselves? Why are we limiting our chances to play the move c5, which is really a key break here for black? Remember that one game when Karpov did nothing in the center, never played the move c5, and ended up suffering for quite a bit. So knight c6, not my favorite move of all time, just doesn't really make sense to me. Bishop g2 now. Castles, castles, bishop takes c3, b takes c3, goes for this structure again. Now the move knight a5, and I'll let you guys at home try and find Garry Kasparov's reply to this move. Note that I may have given you a hint that one particular move is very much an important move for black here. And with this next move, Garry is preventing it forever. Kasparov led by 1 point going into this game. Yes, so Kasparov was up 1 game. This is round 19 of 24. So, you know, not desperate times yet for Karpov, but certainly feeling the pressure of being down a game against the challenger with just 5 games left to go. Okay. Great Wolf has finally returned from lunch. He apologizes for being late to class. I will forgive him on this occasion, but a tardy will be noted on your report card. Okay. Chess is fun, says the move bishop a3. Well, hold on, chess is fun. Your pawn's attacked. Don't lose your pawn. So, in previous games, we had seen Garry play a move like queen d3 to try and hold everything together. Queen d3 in this case doesn't actually make the most sense. You're walking right into the move b6 when bishop a6 is going to put you in a rather uncomfortable pin. So the move that Garry actually came up with here, as Nicholas now is saying, is the move c5. You prevent black from playing c5 himself, you increase your space, and you actually kind of fix your pawn structure in a weird way. Now, Anatoly directly challenges this pawn on c5. It can't really just be allowed to stand there. We need to develop this bishop somehow, so we need to move one of these pawns. So he chose the move d6 to challenge the pawn. And Garry comes up with a really nice move here to continue increasing his activity a little bit. Rather than just play some move like rook d1, like rook b1, like c takes d6, he plays the move c4. And I like this move quite a bit. It's challenging black to take on c5 when afterwards we're going to have, first of all, an e5 square. Look out for that one. Maybe we shouldn't have put our pawn on f5. But yeah, we're going to have an e5 square for the knight that's going to be difficult to drive it away from. We're also going to have pressure along this diagonal now. So Garry really tempting Karpov to go for a little bit more. And perhaps this temptation is going to be enough against some players being down a game towards the end of the match. But Karpov, the professional, just plays b6 instead, challenging this pawn more directly with the b pawn. And now Kasparov plays a slightly counterintuitive move at first glance, but it is with good reason. It's the move bishop d2. Now, in previous games, we had seen that knight takes d2 was a great equalizing idea by Karpov, getting rid of the bishop pair. In this case, though, after it is played, we have knight takes d2. Now, we are gaining a really critical tempo on this rook on a8. If this rook comes to b8, well, now we'll simplify it with c takes d6, and perhaps c takes d6. And after the move knight b3, this knight is just a little bit awkward. You can take on b3, but now your a pawn is slightly weak. You can come back to b7, I suppose, but you don't want to be on b7, almost as bad as g7. And lastly, you can just leave it here on a5. But of course, not the most comfortable structure now for black with these doubled a pawns. So rather than rook b8, Karpov goes for the move d5 here, trying to block out this bishop on the light squares. And this is a hugely combative move. Of course, the most natural move is the move that was played in the game, c takes d5. You get rid of your doubled c pawn, you weaken the light squares further, makes total sense. So e takes d5, and now e3 by Kasparov is just solidifying the structure. And it's clear to see that white is just much better in this position from the opening. It's move 15 now. Both sides have more or less gotten developed after black's next move, bishop e6. But what's going on in the position? Well, white has this beautiful pawn chain of f2 to c5. He has a beautiful bishop on g2. All of the black pawns rather, are locked on light squares, on squares that are easily targetable by the white pieces. And to boot, you know, it's white to move. So going to be a really nice position here for Kasparov. And this is why I just don't like these f5 ideas that Karpov was trying in all of these games. Note, I think in every game where Karpov played f5, he just ended up worse. This is a really, really combative move that risks quite a lot. And if there's one lesson to be learned from all of these games, I think it's that, like, maybe slow down on these f5 ideas, okay, man? Like, they're not great. Not great. Alright, Storm's getting a tardy on his report card too. Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh, these hooligan students. Hooligan students. Okay, queen c3 played in the game. Rook f7, rook fc1, rook b8. I'm going to play through these moves rather quickly as we are beyond the opening, and I do want to do a brief recap. a4 by Kasparov is nice to just keep this pawn right back there on b6. Bishop f7 now by Karpov, bishop f1, challenging some more light squares. h6, and now the reroute of the bishop is complete to an even better square on d3. Queen d7 defends this guy, queen c2 attacks this guy, bishop e6 defends this guy, bishop b5 attacks this guy, queen back to d8. And now there's a little bit of maneuvering. Rook d1, I don't fully understand, but I don't need to understand it. g5, knight f3, heading to e5, rook g7, knight e5, as stated. Note that this f-pawn cannot come to f6 to drive this knight away. So sad. f4 now, bishop back to f1 for just a little bit of defense. Queen f6, bishop g2, rook over to d8, and now the move e4 is nice by Kasparov. This is really the move that's breaking through for him here. You play e4, you break down kind of the last defenders of the black's light squares, and of black's light squares, and the rest is kind of just history here. D takes e4, bishop takes e4, rook e7, queen c3, bishop up to d5, trying to blockade on this d5 square, but just rook e1. And after a few more moves, knight g4, queen f7, takes, 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 rook e1, rook d8, knight e5, daring black to take this guy when you are in an unfortunate pin. Queen f6, c takes b6, queen takes, and now, after, rook takes d4, knight f3, knight b3, rook b1, queen f6, takes c7. Karpov went ahead and resigned this game. Of course, I blew through the rest of this game. Hopefully you all agree with me that after the opening, white is just significantly better. But what have we learned about the three knights variation, as it's called, of the Nimzo-Indian with this move knight f3? Well, black has a lot of different ways to respond, and it really just comes down to the concrete positions. We saw in game one, Karpov got in quite a bit of trouble here after taking this pawn on b2 and stepping to the wrong square, allowing white to consolidate with these pawns, and black in this game had a lot of trouble developing this bishop, a lot of trouble with this pawn on c5. Later on, Karpov tried to do nothing, tried not to play c5, not do anything, and he ended up in a cramped position, just slightly worse. And eventually, we had this one game, game 11, that Karpov lost, where Karpov equalized fairly standardly, going for more IQP standard positions. So these are just various different methods of playing against the three knights that Karpov and Kasparov explored pretty thoroughly in the match. And so this is why I highly recommend looking at World Championship matches for the latest and greatest opening theory. They really explore these variations very, very deeply, and you can learn a lot about the various ideas. Hopefully you enjoyed this edition of Chess Openings Explained as well. If you're watching live, be sure to head over to the Twitch channel. We're going to have an hour of tactics time with yours truly. If you're watching the video version, thank you very much for joining me. My name is Caleb Denby, and I will see you next time.